There's a great deal of talk about Orwell, 1984, and mechanical men, and perhaps we'll all become machines, and we feel kind of low at times. What's going to happen? All of a sudden, something explodes, and something in the person of two young investigative reporters, Carl Bernstein and Bob Woodward. And the book, as you know, is All the President's Men, and they broke the Watergate case. And it occurs to me that this book is one of several dimensions. It's a suspense book. It's great police reporting. It's two young crime reporters, you might say, investigating a gang of thieves. It could be that. The mafia, the syndicate, as it's done. It also is how a newspaper works, and it involves what was happening in the office of the Washington Post with the two reporters, Bernstein, Woodward, and the editors and the associate editors. And also involves the relationship with the two guys themselves. But it involves more than that to me. It involves flesh and blood guys who are excellent journalists against what seems to be a machine. So when did the case break? You first heard about the case 1972, Bob, was it?
Well, the first I became acquainted with the Watergate burglary was early the morning after the 5 men had been arrested there, when the city editor called me and said, "Come in." And the real feeling that the story was going to be something was when James McCord in the courtroom whispered CIA.
CIA. And then there was Carl Bernstein. You and he had never worked together before. You two were metropolitan reporters, not national reporters, and then both of you came to work on it. But at that time, now here's a voice. He's a professor of communications. God help us, that's what he is. And he's telling about how good Nixon is in handling people and stifling them. We're supposed to hear this voice of this professor. At the time, you two guys had just got on to something.
This is right after the major period of the disclosures that were in the Washington
So here's
Post.
the voice.
I think, from what little I can find out from people who have studied Nixon in our field, strictly on an academic basis, reporting what we know to somebody else who we know, rather than to the public. Nixon uses his people wisely and gets the information, whether he wants to hear it or not, that will help him. And that he will avoid certain kinds of behavior and be attracted to certain kinds of messages, certain kinds of themes. I think in the last 4 years, the Nixon administration has so carefully softened the power of the press that the press is taken more lightly than ever before in its existence, in my mind. That's, I think, why the Watergate affair was so delicately brushed aside by the American people.
Now, as we listen to the voice of Professor, I call him Jack Hunter, you both read parts of the book. The book is written sort of third person, isn't it?
Third person.
Yeah. And suppose Woodward tells about Bernstein's revelation when he first came to it, and Bernstein, you, Carl, tell about Woodward's. So
the book really is a story of the newspaper business and reporting, and it starts out that first day in June 1772 and tracks us in the Washington Post through the story as we learn a more incredible piece of the puzzle and write stories for the paper. One of the most interesting parts, perhaps, in the book is a section that in a sense deals with the press, on how the White House is responding, how they are stonewalling us. And besides not responding to stories, they're denouncing the Washington Post and saying we're printing hearsay, character assassination, and innuendo. And at this point in the book, on page 105, we've just involved John Mitchell in the story and received what we call a non-denial from the White House, namely an attack on the newspaper, really, and a denial that it's true, but really not speaking to the issue. So Carl decided to call John Mitchell at his home in New York. Do you want to lead in with anything on that, Carl?
Only that it was perhaps the most important story up until that point. It said that John Mitchell, the former Attorney General of the United States, that while he was the nation's top law enforcement officer, had controlled the secret funds that funded the Watergate operation and other undercover activities.
And these are from Carl's notes as he wrote them that night after the conversation. Got Mitchell on the phone. He answered, "Mitchell, yes." Bernstein, after identifying himself, "Sir, I'm sorry to bother you at this hour, but we are running a story in tomorrow's paper that in effect says you controlled secret funds at the Committee for the Re-election of the President while you were Attorney General." Mitchell, "Gee, you said that?" What does it say? Bernstein. I'll read you the first few paragraphs. He got about as far as the third, and Mitchell responded again, geez, after every few words. Then Mitchell said, all that crap, you're putting it in the paper? It's all been denied. Katie Graham, referring to the publisher of the Washington Post, Katie Graham's going to get her tit caught in a big fat ringer if that's published. Good Christ, that's the most sickening thing I've ever heard. Bernstein, who, by the way, I might add, who's not used to talking to the former chief law enforcement officer of the United States. Bernstein said, sir, I'd like to ask you a few questions about... Mitchell interrupts. What time is it? Bernstein, 11:30. I'm sorry to call so late. Mitchell, 11:30? 11:30 when? Bernstein, 11:30 at night. Mitchell, oh. Bernstein, the committee has issued a statement about the story, but I'd like to ask you a few questions about the specifics of what the story contains. Mitchell, did the committee tell you to go ahead and publish that story? You fellows got a great ball game going. As soon as you're through paying Ed Williams, a reference to the attorney for the Washington Post, and the rest of those fellows, we're going to do a story on all of you. Bernstein, sir, about the story. Mitchell, call my law office in the morning. And then Mitchell hung up.
You know what's so interesting about that conversation is, in retrospect, is that occurred on September the 29th. And of course the White House transcripts show the president and Dean talking on September 15th in very much the same terms, and specifically taking action involving Ed Bennett Williams, who's referred to in that discussion as that son of a bitch Williams.
What interests me also, by the way, is both of you, the acuteness of both of you in picking up revelations unintentional apart. Now, Mitchell obviously was astonished, wasn't he, when you, Carl Bernstein, called him, that it broke, isn't that
well,
it?
I think that his reaction, we describe it in the book somewhat as almost that Jesus as being some kind of primal scream. We had said the words out loud that the grand jury hadn't said, even though it might have had some of the same information.
When he said that Jesus, I think we thought it was a prayer.
Yeah.
But he was obviously in some kind of excruciating pain, knowing that finally somebody had in essence said the former Attorney General has broken the law.
You see, that's why we had that mechanical sounding voice in the beginning of the guy who says, everything's set, nothing the press can do, so on. But
the reaction was rather consistent.
Yeah.
The other passage that you pointed out yourself here, discussion between Bob and a source known as Deep Throat, who was perhaps the most sensitive source that we had. He occupied a high, sensitive position in the executive branch of the federal government. The passage begins, Woodward nodded. How'd the Post like its subpoenas, Deep Throat asked. Just great, said Woodward. That's only the first step. Our president has gone on a rampage about news leaks on Watergate. He's told the appropriate people, go to any length to stop them. When he says that, he really means business, internal investigations, plus he wants to use the courts. There was a discussion about whether to go the criminal route or the civil suit route first. At a meeting, Nixon said that the money left over from the campaign, about $5 million or so, might as well be used to take the Washington Post down a notch. Thus, your subpoenas and the others. Part of the discussion was about starting a grand jury investigation, but that's for later. Nixon was wild, shouting and hollering that we can't have it and we've got to stop it. I don't care how much it costs. His theory is that the news media have gone way too far and the trend has to be stopped, almost like he was talking about federal spending. He's fixed on the subject and doesn't care how much time it takes. He wants it done. To him, the question is no less than the very integrity of government and basic loyalty. He thinks the press is out to get him and therefore is disloyal. People who talk to the press are even worse. The enemies within or something like that.
Yeah, isn't it funny, as you're talking, both of you, the press and the reputation it has, credibility, the overused word, and what you did to suddenly make something else incredible, unbelievable, and that's those who put down the press.
The point that the professor who we just heard on tape made is a very valid one. This administration was singularly successful in undermining the credibility of the press. I think you can trace it back perhaps as far as when Vice President Agnew, then Vice President, made a speech in Des Moines, Iowa, in which he called on the press to use its powers of investigation for the purposes of some self-examination. statement which I think Bob and I agree with, but perhaps for different reasons.
See, which is what
than
I find more
Mr.
astonishing, Carl and Bob, about your book, which I find a very important book, is that the press was never really that great. You and I.F. Stone know it. You know, it was never really that great. I'm talking about the White House correspondence. You have marvelous, a very pertinent footnote here somewhere that, quoting John Osborne, how the press is snowed by the presidency, and certainly snowed by Kissinger.
Well, in the Mitchell conversation that Carl had, where Mitchell says at that point, did the committee tell you to go ahead and publish that? It's almost as if they have the power to say, okay, that can go in the paper and that can go in the paper. And I guess the point of the book really is, because it is that story of journalism, that you have to sort of go toe-to-toe with these people. You have to say, our sources say this, we have the following information, and you can deny it, you can threaten the publisher with having a portion of her anatomy going through the ringer, but nonetheless, you put it in the paper.
Now we come to how you two worked and the obstacles you faced. And you have a little dedication to, it's called All the President's Men, Simon and Schuster, the publishers. But you dedicate to those, not all, some of them had the courage and to tell you things. Now we come to the big wall you had to scale, the fear of people, the incredible fear of those revealing. Wasn't that the big one?
Interestingly enough, it was, even though we weren't getting much information when we first encountered this fear, it told us something that we didn't know, and that was that the stakes of Watergate were much higher than we ever perceived. This was in August and September of '72. The White House and the Committee for the Re-election of the President were still vehemently denying any connection whatsoever with Watergate. And we went around and started visiting the homes of low-level White House and Committee for the Re-election of the President employees. And doors were slammed in our faces, but very often before the doors were slammed, someone would say something like, you can't be seen here, they follow me, I'm afraid they've got my phone tapped, there are terrible things going on, but I can't talk about them. And that fear told us something that we really didn't perceive until then.
Now, these were people, a woman you call the bookkeeper, a different one would come to Hugh Sloan, the most sympathetic of the people. But you had to get your foot in the door, didn't you? I subtitled the book "Foot in the Door," by the way.
Well, one of the interesting scenes in there is where Carl learns that there is this bookkeeper who may know something, somebody who worked for Maurice Stans may know something about all this loose cash that seemed to be floating around, because we had just done a story about $25,000 campaign check that went in the bank account of one of these burglars, and that was really the first major story that made it clear to us that there was something here. And when Carl went to the bookkeeper's house, Carl identified himself, and the bookkeeper said, "Oh no, you've got to go away, you can't be here," and gave the standard routine. And in order to get a foot in the door, Carl saw a pack of cigarettes, I guess, laying on the table, and said, "Can I have a cigarette?" And then she, being a kind person, said, "Okay, here's a cigarette." And then the bookkeeper had her sister there, I believe.
Coffee.
And the sister said, well, would you like some coffee? And Carl said, yes, indeed. And then drank one of the slowest cups of coffee in the history of coffee drinking.
Well, the question, isn't it now, you're talking to us about people, now some of the people doing this work, we're talking about a mechanical situation, are basically decent people, like this bookkeeper caught, isn't that it?
Very much so. Certainly there were a lot of fine people who worked for the Committee for the Re-election of the President, who still work in the White House, and the bookkeeper was one of them. There's a very interesting part, again, in the White House transcripts. It's very interesting how the transcripts have illuminated kind of parts of the book, where John Dean and the President are talking, and John Dean starts to talk about this little pocket of secretaries in the office of Maurice Stans and what a potential problem they are. Well, we were fortunate enough, in the case of the bookkeeper and some other people, to get into that pocket. And it was there that we started to learn about the money. And the money told us that, yes, there had been a secret fund that financed these activities. And that put us on to who controlled the secret fund, which is...
Really put us on to Hugh Sloan, who probably takes up 70 or 80 pages in the book. And
for the first time, his name is revealed in this book, that he was your source, aside from...
A source, right.
A source, aside
one
from
of
Deep Throat.
many
Yes,
sources,
of
but
course.
a key source. And again, the process is, and I think probably for people who don't know much about newspaper reporting, it's revealing that these unnamed sources are not people who are the classic leakers who want to come in and say, here's the whole story, but people who are in privileged positions, caught with divided loyalties, and you prevail upon them. As Carl has said, we sort of felt like vultures going out to Sloan's house the dozen or more times we did, because he was always so reluctant, but you could get in and have a cup of coffee, and then he'd maybe tell you
And
something.
once you have one piece of information, you can use it to pry loose another piece of information. That's really, I think, the key to this kind of reporting, and it's a step-by-step, slow, excruciating extraction process.
I think it should be pointed out. It's quite obvious that what Carl Bernstein and Bob Woodward did is very tough, investigative, sloughing through the mud in every sense, work.
The real point is it's not about leaks, and I think we're hearing a lot too much
Yeah.
about leaks now.
You guys connected seemingly disconnected events, and suddenly it all came to
Right.
pass.
And that's what really made Watergate more than just a burglary at the Democratic headquarters, and it was that connecting of events that we were able to do through the information we got from our sources that made it clear that secret operations in the White House were the order of the day, really, and that the Segretti Dirty Tricks operation was related to Watergate.
What happened is really a funny kind of thing. That we didn't get many anonymous tips from people calling in that we didn't know, but one night a gentleman called me who said he was an attorney for the government, no connection with any of the Watergate matters, and he said he had heard this rather crazy story from a friend who was approached by a friend to do some work for the Nixon campaign in a rather unusual way, which is to say to go around and sabotage the Democratic primaries. And he gave me the name of his friend, a gentleman named Alex Shipley, who was an assistant attorney general in the state of Tennessee. And I got hold of Shipley, and he proceeded to tell me this rather bizarre story about the travels of Donald Segretti, a young California lawyer who had just gotten out of the Army, and who had attempted to recruit Shipley and others to conduct some rather vicious political sabotage and espionage during those primaries. And it suddenly, to us, started to make some sense out of Watergate. At this time, Watergate was an isolated incident. Nobody could really understand why Watergate on June the 17th, when the president's re-election seemed all but assured. But if it was part of something larger, it made sense. And in the course of a routine conversation with a government official who was concerned with the case, a government attorney, I just sort of threw out the name Donald Segretti, and expecting to get no response. And the government attorney went into a rampage. He was just furious.
You found out something.
And said that if you could find out about that kind of conduct and about Segretti's operation, it would really tell you something that would stagger you.
Yeah, I'm thinking, let's stick with the Segretti thing, because to me the book has so many dimensions. You talk about Segretti and the group of guys who were at the University of Southern California,
Right.
and they were doing little tricks, but suddenly become big tricks. And the kiddie corps of he hired young kids, right, to penetrate the Quakers, to be agents provocateurs, right? And you ask one of the kids about, how do you feel about ethics, What do you mean ethics? No, see, to me this is very important, too, in your book. That's a new kind of something in our society. Maybe it's always been, but this horrendous amorality. That's also what you find out, isn't it?
There certainly was a good deal of amorality, I think, in the way this campaign was
I'm
conducted.
talking about the using of young people, too.
That was one of the most outrageous things, really, and it obviously to the young people who were approached to do this, somebody called it sandbox politics, really. That it was sort of kids stuff, and some of it seemed just to be pranks, but then you really looked into it, and some of it was extremely
The Committee
vicious.
for the Re-election of the President went so far as to attempt to fix mock elections in high schools.
This is the point. It's almost a burlesque in a way. It's almost like a musical comedy if we weren't
it
that
weren't
close.
so tragic.
If we weren't so close to a police state. Now, what would have happened? This is a conjecture. Just What would have happened if you guys didn't break it? I'm curious. And Watergate, as our friend in the beginning said, was buried, you know.
Well, it was a process of interaction between the press and the numerous government investigations, and it's a very iffy question. We did some of the stories, but Time Magazine, the New York Times, others did a lot, and it really brought Watergate to the pitch, and particularly in the Segretti activities, which the Justice Department refused to investigate, that led Senator Ervin, and there's described an interview I had with Senator Ervin about this before he set up his committee, who said, now this is something we've got to look at. Who was tampering with the political process? And then he set up his investigation, and then led to the events forming the special prosecutor and the impeachment proceedings. So it was always not only evolutionary from the point of view of the evidence we gained, but who was the investigative agency or agent.
Yeah.
Another thing that I think had a lot to do with this was that the stakes were raised, perhaps to a point of no return, by the White House deciding that it would make the conduct of the press the issue rather than the conduct of the president's men. By attacking us, attacking the Washington Post in particular, in the manner and intensity that the White House did, it made this an irredeemable game, as it were. That if one side turned out to be wrong, that side, its credibility was going to be, if not destroyed, certainly impaired tremendously.
You know, there's also, in your book, as we throughout, there's this question of the investigations of Bernstein and Woodward. That's now celebrated and known, and it should be, I hope, even more known, that there was a human aspect to it. You yourself had ethical problems, too. We come to that, don't you?
Oh, yes, indeed. We went into a period after we had made an error on the H.R. Haldeman story, which was an error in attribution, saying somebody had testified before the grand jury that Haldeman controlled this secret fund. In fact, he had controlled it, and as his indictment suggests, there's some serious allegations against him. Nonetheless, we had said that somebody had so testified, and they had not, and the White House was able to attack that story quite effectively. And then
that was a critical moment for you guys. Yeah,
it's probably the worst moment we ever had.
Because then the question is, are you guys going to be tossed in the can for one thing?
We considered resigning, as a matter of fact, because it was. Although the substance of the report was accurate, the stories had been building. We had a pretty much airtight track record, and then all of a sudden it was as if the ground had been cut from under us.
And in the desperation of that day, when it became quite clear to us that we had made this mistaken attribution, we went around to check with the sources of information, one of them being an FBI agent, and he wouldn't talk to us about it, and we felt both responsible and desperate to find out how we had made this mistake, and so we went and told the agent's boss that the agent had talked to us, and this, in a sense, was really blowing a source. The man did not get in trouble, thank heavens, but it's something that,
absolutely unforgivable. I mean, I think it's something we would never do again.
I'm thinking even deeper than that, and that's Carl, and to get the records from the telephone company, I'm thinking of. There again, now, I realize the situation. This is something we're faced at a certain moment.
Well, what's so interesting is, to me, is that we were confronted with ethical problems not unlike people at the White House very often.
Tell them about that telephone.
The telephone
record, what it was for.
That's important.
And very early, this was in July, only a month or 6 weeks after the break-in, I attempted to get some telephone records of Bernard Barker.
One of the Watergate burglars.
As well as some credit card records. In fact, I also used credit card records on Segretti. And in both instances, I was able to get the records. And I kept wondering to myself, if this was, if they were records on me, I'd be outraged if I knew a reporter had been able to go to AT&T or to go to a major credit card company and get this information, which is supposedly confidential. And it gets into a whole question of when do the ends justify the means, which of course has a lot to do with Watergate and the whole mentality behind it. And we were constantly faced with that same kind of question.
Yeah. What a hell of a...
And we don't know the answers.
Yeah. But yet you had to. If you didn't get those records of Barker or those Segretti expenditures, whatever, you wouldn't have been able to go follow through. Yeah.
That's right. In the main example was visiting grand jurors, which in the desperation after the Haldeman error, is Ben Bradley, the editor at the Post, said he was going to hold our heads in a pail of water until we came up with a story. And in that desperation, we went around, talked to grand jurors, something that is not illegal, but certainly something highly questionable, getting into that secret process.
We'll come to a really humorous moment in that, too.
Fortunately, we got no information whatsoever from the grand jurors, which would have compounded the problem if we had.
And then Sirica. Oh, this is a very funny scene there. Perhaps before we
Wasn't
take
funny
a
if
slight,
you were there.
Yeah, it wasn't funny. A slight break, though. Before we take a slight break, the idea of Sirica had found out he was bawling out a couple of correspondents. A lot of journalists were there, right?
That's right.
And he was bawling out, and they didn't know it was you guys, did they?
You wanted us to tell that now or later?
Well, tell that now, and then we'll take a slight pause.
Oh, okay. Well, it was a situation where some of the people that we approached, one or more, went to the prosecutors and said these reporters are coming around asking us to break our oath, and prosecutors went to Judge Sirica, who was outraged, and told our lawyer that we'd better be down in the courtroom a
December
couple of
19th.
days before Christmas. We went down there. I got a haircut, and we put on our nicest suits, and we figured we were headed for jail, or at least a public unveiling that we were not looking forward to. Judge Sirica came out and said a member of the news media had approached the grand jurors and issued a lecture and commended the grand jurors not for talking, and then left the courtroom and did not name us. And there were about 30 correspondents there.
Then there was this kind of mad rush to the hallways, in which the various reporters started asking each other whom they suspected, and was it you, and we in effect engaged in our own cover-up. We
You guys, who, me? How
Right.
dare you?
That's right. We sounded
we
like
evaded,
the worst
we
in the White House.
misrepresented,
here's
dodged, ran
Here's
for the
crazy
elevators.
part. At the same time, a guy named Lawrence, John Lawrence, the L.A. Times, was protecting a source. You know, in the tradition of the free press, he gets put in the pokey.
That's right.
That's correct. That same day by the same judge.
And I remember coming back from that hearing just
I've never seen
Totally
Woodward
split.
so shaken.
Yeah, and it was it. Bernstein, rarely seen Woodward so shaken. They're both painfully aware of the contrast. So a slight pause here as we're talking to Carl Bernstein and Bob Woodward, and the book is All the President's Men that Simon and Schuster published. And you can see it's more than a suspense story of the work of two investigative journalists, but it's about our society too, and where to, what next, and what have we learned from Watergate. But more of this and their techniques in a moment after this pause. Resuming the conversation with Carl Bernstein, Bob Woodward, and All the President's Men, talking about how you got things on the telephone. People tell you things, a phrase, and so they mean to, like Judge Roby, early in the case, as a federal judge.
Judge Ritchie.
Ritchie,
Right.
I'm sorry. And this is, to me, fantastic. He told you something. He called you, didn't he?
Correct.
This is what he said. This is during the campaign. Election not
This
yet
is
held.
while the Democrats' civil suit was being argued. The Democrats had filed a civil suit against the Committee for the Re-election of the President stemming from the break-in. And the purpose of the suit was really not so much to win money damages as to get disclosure through calling in officials of the committee to take their depositions. And inexplicably, Judge Ritchie, on August the 22nd, 1972...
He was the judge hearing the case.
Right, Judge Ritchie reversed a decision that he himself had made a week earlier and ordered all the depositions sealed and that no further testimony be taken until after the criminal proceedings had finished, which in effect meant that there would be no disclosure under oath before the election. And then later that day, he called me, and I had never talked to the judge in my life. And he said, I just wanted you to know that the reason for this was to protect everybody's civil rights and liberties, and it had absolutely nothing to do with any ex parte communication.
You never asked this, did you?
I never asked. It was like a bolt out of the blue. The idea that anyone would approach a federal judge to me was unthinkable.
Of course, this question is left hanging, isn't it?
Well, there were allegations, John Dean's testimony, that a lawyer named Romer McPhee in Washington had acted sort of as go-between the Committee for the Re-election of the President and the judge. the allegations have been denied, and there's really been no resolution of that.
Well, John Mitchell testified that indeed there had been, I think, almost a dozen meetings, although John Mitchell said that the purpose of the meetings was perfectly proper.
You talk about a tangled scheme that you guys are untangling, but how profound it is and horrendous, you know. Then the news, I'm thinking about how you guys work. So some guy leaked something, and the name Ehrlichman came in on page 237 here. Some guy's talking to you on the phone. And suddenly, Woodward snapped a pencil in half between his fingers. The guy dropped the name you didn't expect him to drop.
That's right. And Ehrlichman really had the reputation as the program man in the White House. Very human person, not rigid like Haldeman was supposedly. And for someone to bring Ehrlichman in again and to suggest that his name might come out at the Watergate trial was rather astonishing. Deep Throat had earlier told me, in fact, that Ehrlichman had ordered Howard Hunt out of the country, and sort of with this excess of caution, I really shouldn't call it an excess. I think it was appropriate, but we kept things out of the paper until we were absolutely sure. And this is something Carl would try to get in a story or two, and
Woodward would keep killing it. We had a rule that we wouldn't put anything in the paper involving improper activity or allegations unless it was confirmed by two independent sources, meaning really from different ends of the spectrum, which is to say if somebody in the Committee for the Re-election of the President told us that John Mitchell controlled some fund, we'd have to have that information either from someone in the FBI or in the Justice Department or someone in the White House with first-hand knowledge of it, just so we could nail all the corners down and know that we were perfectly safe.
There's some marvelous moments here of humor, too. You two guys is fighting near the water cooler. That's also part. Now, I'm curious, did the guys on the city desk, we'll come to the question of you guys being local report, the guys around all know you're working on this and they kept it pretty well?
We kept the information as closely held in the office as we could. Once it reached the point where we saw that it was going in unprecedented directions. I remember the day probably of the most important story, the October 10th story, which said that Watergate was just a small part of a massive campaign of political espionage and sabotage. Gradually the word started to go through the newsroom that there was a package of stories that was coming that was going to sort of go like a rocket through the White House, and there were editors coming around and peering over everyone's shoulder.
The role of the editors in this story is very interesting, and really after the sources and after ourselves in the book, the main characters
This is Bradley and Simons and Sussman.
That's right.
Harry Rosenfeld, the Metropolitan editor.
We had
also.
4 editors. First, we were assigned to the local desk and still are, in fact. The immediate editor, a fellow named Barry Sussman, who was really sort of the conceptual editor, worked with us very, very hard on these stories and would always ask the question, okay, you've written this story, now where does it go? Who do you need to talk to? How does this fit in? Then immediately above him is the Metropolitan editor of the Post, Harry Rosenfeld, who's really sort of somebody out of front page. He runs around the newsroom screaming and yelling, very demanding, insistent man, but at the same time probably the supreme expert on reading a story and seeing a hole in it. Then after him is Howard Simons, the managing editor, a meticulous former science reporter who sort of acts as a brake, a very, very cautious person.
Tell us a lot. When in doubt, leave it out. That really was the rule.
And then Ben Bradley, the executive editor, very sophisticated old-timer who's been around Washington and the journalism profession for about 25, actually
Now we
more
come
than
to
20.
something else here, little conflicts and 2 different approaches. Bradley is very much like Bob Woodward. He wants hard fact. You want hard fact, right? Whereas you, Carl, were working on hunches, intuitive stuff. Is that it? Isn't that the idea?
I like to deal in deduction and to sort of get an idea where I'm going next and follow that direction. Bob much prefers hard information. He's impatient with theories. Bradley's the same way. But what's so interesting is that within the Washington Post that you had both reporters and editors whose skills kind of complemented each other and who served as brakes on each other.
But the buck really did stop with Bradley. He was, as the #1 editor, the person who had to sit in there each night and read over the story, interrogate us somewhat like a prosecutor, in fact, saying, "Where'd you get that? What'd they say?"
Because he had his fingers burned once, didn't he, when he was with Newsweek, see? That's it, and he wanted to make sure you guys got it, and that's up. Bill
Actually,
Moyers,
that was another
You have
sort
it
of
in your book
incident.
here.
It was when we learned that Dean and Haldeman were going to have to resign from the White House staff, and we learned this about 2 weeks before it happened. And we were thinking of writing the story, and Bradley recalled when he had, working for Newsweek, written a story that J. Edgar Hoover was going to resign and going to be
But
replaced.
he got it from
He had
LBJ's press.
He got
got
the
it
story from Bill
from
Moyers,
didn't
who
he?
was Johnson's press secretary. And Bradley went ahead and wrote the story, put it in Newsweek, and Mr. Hoover apparently was very successful in resisting. And the next thing that Bradley knew, Lyndon Johnson told Bill Moyers, well,
No, Johnson held a press conference and
That's
appointed Hoover FBI director for life, and as he walked out, he leaned over to Moyers and said, "You call up Ben Bradley and tell him expletive deleted you."
that you just got him
By the way,
appointed
let's
for
stick
life.
with the FBI for a moment. And Hoover is the role of the FBI, a rather flaccid role. Oh, Hoover, by the way, threatened to expose the taps, didn't he, if he were forced to resign?
There's an allegation to that effect. The 17 wiretaps on government officials and news reporters.
But coming back to the FBI, you guys were also impelling something to happen. Now, somewhere along the line, this stuff wasn't really coming out as much as it should be, should it?
In what sense?
That was the FBI really doing its job,
Well, certainly we would call people and find out that they hadn't been interviewed by the FBI. A good example, Jeb Magruder's secretary had never been interviewed by the FBI. Robert Reisner, Magruder's principal assistant, who we now know was the person who took the gemstone file, the actual wiretap file, the weekend of the break-in. It was in his possession for a while. Magruder asked him to take it out of his desk. The FBI had never talked to him. We would go through address books that were introduced in evidence at the trial and call the telephone numbers in them, and people would answer the phone and say, "Oh, the first I ever heard about it. Never heard from the FBI."
And also the prosecutors. Silbert and those guys weren't really doing a job, you point out here. Some guys were telling you that.
Well, that's one of the most complicated things to unravel, the role of the prosecutors in this case. They did a lot of things right, but I think there was either a certain timidity or naivete almost, and not understanding the lines of authority in the White House.
They were manipulated also. I think, again, the White House transcript show that. I think no one has questioned the integrity of the three prosecutors. I think they're men of unquestioned integrity. But interestingly enough, I think that where we perhaps were a little bit more successful than the prosecutors was in understanding the atmosphere of the White House, the lines of authority there, and the same in the Committee for the Re-election of the President. Deep Throat, at one point in the book, refers to it as the siege mentality. And had the prosecutors been much more aware of that mentality than they were, and the lines of authority, I think perhaps that they wouldn't have been manipulated quite so readily.
You're talking about siege mentality, Deep Throat. Now the stakes are getting higher and higher as you guys are putting it together more and more. And now the fear is getting... And when the name Haldeman came into play, that's when it underwent almost a qualitative
Everyone
change,
ducked
didn't it?
for cover because he, as the president's #1 assistant, ran the White House with an iron hand. And that is one of the things that we learned, and it became quite clear to us that there was very little that went on in the White House that Haldeman didn't either approve or authorize or know about. And this is one of the reasons for if you have to fault the federal investigation, it was the unwillingness to investigate the Segretti activities. As you may recall, Segretti, one of his contacts was Dwight Chapin, the president's appointment secretary. He was paid by Herbert Kalmbach, the president's personal attorney. Now, these are very, very high people, but they wouldn't look at that. They interviewed the people, and then they stopped.
And they knew in that case. For instance, there's a conversation in the book where I speak with a government attorney who's obviously concerned with a case, and I use the old USC term for the type of political espionage and sabotage that was conducted. The term was, and I mentioned the word to this government attorney, and he says, you can go right to the top on that one. He says, and I say, you mean Mitchell? And he says, higher than Mitchell even, all the way to the top.
But they, Kleindienst, quite with a great deal of pride at this point, came out and said, we're not investigating that stuff. That's dirty tricks.
Political pranks.
And it's now clear Segretti pleaded guilty to violating the law in a number of cases on this. And I mean, some of it was vicious material, putting out those letters.
Right. And Segretti had been hired by Dwight Chapin, the President's appointment secretary, and with the approval of Haldeman, as Mr. Haldeman later acknowledged.
Talking about pranks, remember when that case first broke? You guys are working on it now. We didn't know you guys are that deep in it. The word caper was used, and the word caper has a light quality to it, almost a musical comedy quality, Lavender Hill Mob quality, doesn't it? That's not really serious. I was very impressed with that, in a negative way. The fact the word caper was always used,
Actually,
not serious.
that's a term developed by Jack Anderson, the investigative reporter, and he quickly disposed of it. And in a sense, you look at it, five of these guys.
It seemed like a caper at first. It wasn't until after August 1st and then after October 10th that you really began to understand the dimensions of this thing.
August 1st being the story about the $25,000 campaign contribution.
Now, what he adds up to is the destruction of the whole electoral process.
Exactly.
Well, the destruction of everything. See?
Potentially.
But there's something else here that's funny and strange. You got the Clausen, who was once a colleague of yours, right? He used to work at the Post, and now he's working for the Citizens Committee.
At the time, Ken Clausen was the deputy director of communications at the White House.
Here's a marvelous and funny comment about morality. He was involved with the Canuck letter, the framed letter that half destroyed
allegedly.
Allegedly.
Yes.
But he wasn't worried about that so much as a girl reporter. He visited a girl reporter's apartment where she has many visitors, and that's what was bothering him.
That's laid out in some detail.
That's a very funny scene.
It's
in
a hilarious
the book.
Conversation in there between Marilyn Berger, the reporter in question, and Clausen, in which what had happened was that Clausen, according to Marilyn Berger, had told her that he wrote the Canuck letter. Subsequently, he denied...
We should describe the Canuck letter.
Right.
It is a letter that supposedly was written to a New Hampshire paper just before that very crucial primary, alleging that Senator Muskie, then the front-runner, had condoned a racial slur against French Canadians of Canuck, and it was very celebrated and one of the factors that led to Muskie's crying speech.
And Clausen, according to Marilyn Berger, who told us the story, came to her apartment and said, I wrote the Canuck letter. He subsequently denied and said there must have been some misunderstanding, but when we went with this rather huge story that combined the Segretti operation and the Canuck letter and some other dirty tricks, Clausen seemed much more concerned about the fact that he was in Marilyn Berger's apartment having a drink than anything about the activity itself, to the point where at one point he says, Marilyn, don't you understand? I have a wife and a dog and a cat.
No, what hits me about that is what is morality? We'll say, Gore Vidal's Play the Best Man. Our version of morality, the version we have, is man, woman, and boudoir. That's amoral, But the idea of knifing people and gypping people is not amoral. That's what I'm talking about.
Certainly within the Nixon White House, again, getting back to the siege mentality, that anything was considered fair game. That if Hugh Sloan describes this rarefied atmosphere in the book, that you thought you really had the power and almost the responsibility to do anything without worrying too much about the law.
Well, in talking about the Canuck letter, Clausen is, in later denying that he wrote it, said that he told Maryland, I wish I had written it,
right.
which sort of conveys the whole notion that it's a dirty trick that seemed to be a factor in knocking Muskie out, who was really the person that the White House
one does
feared.
it effectively, no matter how violent it might be, does it well, by you succeed. I'm a bastard, I admit it. Well, you got to give me credit.
That's how you earn your spurs.
Yeah. So we come to more and more as the case is building. You guys are getting it put together more and more. Fear is also being compounded, isn't it? The fears now.
I think there were two levels of fear. One was our own occasional paranoia, and the other had to do with the fear of losing our credibility, and also that the White House had the ability to retaliate against the Washington Post.
And also, I think you're talking about the fear in in the president's inner circle, among even the secretaries and the aides, that somehow somebody's going to unravel the sock. And we now know, it's now clear why there had to be a cover-up in Watergate, because Howard Hunt and Gordon Liddy were engaged in so many things: faking cables, the Ellsberg break-in, numerous other things that one, if they started talking about, was going to lead, the whole house was going to come down.
No, I'm thinking also the fear that you were feeling. You met, because perhaps it even described your meetings with Deep Throat, this man, this person you know.
I think you're talking particularly about May 17th, 1973.
When suddenly you realized that somebody might get hurt. I mean, really hurt.
Well,
killed. Such
what happened is that Bob had a meeting with Deep Throat that night, and he called me at the office and said, "Come over to my apartment right away." And I got there, and he put his hand over his lips to indicate silence, and he went and put on a record, in this case a Rachmaninoff concerto. He's got awful taste in music. And
you know, you put that out.
so turned it up real loud to make sure that if anything was bugged, that nothing could be heard. And then he took a piece of paper and wrote a little note to me, and it says, "Deep Throat says everyone's life is in danger." And I said, "You know, what's going on? Is Deep Throat going a little crazy this time or what?" And Woodward shakes his head. And then he sits down at the typewriter and proceeds to do an itemized list of 17 topics that he and Deep Throat discussed that night. Basically, what those topics involved was the whole Watergate cover-up, what we've heard about in the last year about the president's alleged involvement, the Howard Hunt blackmail scheme, the attempt to blackmail the White House, executive clemency, offers to some of the now accused conspirators of executive clemency. And it turns out that 16 of those items on the list have all checked out. And the one that we never had any basis for knowing was true was that everyone or anyone's life was in danger.
It tended to symbolize the notion that the stakes were increasing, that now there were serious allegations against the President of the United States, something that we had a difficult time dealing with
I'll ask you guys a
ourselves.
question. Did you guys, any moment at that period, feel scared yourselves?
Sure, of course. That night we felt very scared, and actually Carl suggested that we've got to unload this information on somebody in a responsible position. So we rousted Ben Bradley, our editor, out of bed at 3 a.m. and went over to his house and held a conversation on his front lawn, just
Like the
because
house
we were
might be
afraid.
bugged.
Because of
We
the
started
possibility.
inside the house, and Bradley started to read this memo, and he started to discuss it.
He got
and I said, "Don't say anything," and he started to look around the living room as if he was, like a stranger in his own house or something.
So that was see.
And the next day we met, in fact, with the editors and other reporters on the roof garden at the Post because we were afraid the office was bugged.
Yeah. So it could be, it could not be true. It might be true, and also paranoia sets in here too, which is quite justifiable.
Well,
might
I
not be
don't know.
paranoia at all.
We look back on it sort of. We were responding in a protective way to our own position, whether it was called for or not. I just
I'm
don't
thinking
know.
I'm sorry, Bob.
No, go ahead.
As you were meeting Deep Throat, you have certain. The book, by the way, was very dramatic, and it's the reality, the truth, how you met him, the arrangements, and the underground garage that you sat there. Weren't there are moments in taking cabs in different places, and he meets you. It sounds as though either you guys might have been knocked off very easily.
Well, there was. I mean, in that case, particularly important to protect the person involved.
To protect his identity,
Yeah.
I think that's what we were more concerned about than physical well-being
Well,
at that point.
It's interesting how we came to write this book. Sort of, as we were writing these stories, we were pretty much convinced in the fall of '72 that we got a corner on the White House secret operations, and we had hints that there was much more there than we knew, just the Watergate burglary.
And that there was an organized cover-up occurring.
And so we contracted to write a book, sort of a Howard Hunt, Gordon Liddy, John Mitchell book, that where they went and what they did, which would be sort of a history. And we actually started to write such a book, 3 or 4 chapters. Then McCord's letter charging perjury in a cover-up was released in March of '73, and the dam broke. And at that point, it became clear that we were going to have to finish this book in the midst of this story. We were going to have to concentrate on our role and we wrote the book. And one of the people who really helped us in this is our editor at Simon & Schuster, Alice Mayhew, because we didn't have much time. We were still working on the story. And
I'm thinking of a very enthusiastic review by Gary Wills in the New York Review of Books, in which he says, of course you guys were police reporters, crime reporters. You were investigating, in a sense, a mafia, you know. And the language used, you were kind of shaken when he did the phrase, "I'll drop it in the deep six," you know, a deep six, as though it was guys in Chicago and Cicero talking, you know.
Yeah, the language.
The language.
Sometimes was really stunning, and by the language I don't mean the kind of language that we've heard in the presidential transcripts, which is to say the expletives. I think Woodward and I use them ourselves, and we do in the book for that matter. But rather the idea of the president and his closest aides speaking as conspirators.
Yeah, this is the part
saying,
that-
Joe, we're going to get caught on this. You better drop it in the river on the way home.
So it's not accidental that two local reporters, in a sense, two metropolitan rather than national reporters, did
Well, I
this.
think in a sense that's what the book is really about. It's about Washington journalism and how it's practiced and how it's not practiced. John Mitchell, this gets back to the sort of the beginning, the point you made at the beginning of the show with the learned professor there. John Mitchell said very early in this administration, watch what we do, not what we say. Well, I think you can see that the Washington Press Corps, certainly for the better part of 4 years, concentrated on watching what they said, not what they did. And indeed, maybe the press bears a measure of responsibility for the Watergate mentality, in the sense that had we watched what was really going on, not what Ron Ziegler said.
But perhaps we could end, even though all we're doing here is just touching on the book, All the President's Men, with Carl Bernstein and Bob Woodward. This conversation occurs not too long after the righteous indignation of Henry Kissinger on his veracity being questioned. And I thought immediately, of course, of Peter Sellers and Dr. Strangelove. And the identical role-playing was fantastic. He'd be great as Sellers, by the way. There's a scene here toward the end. We probably end with this, you know. Woodward is questioning Kissinger. The fact that you're questioning him in itself, you know. Do you want to read that, Pat?
This is more than a year ago, the very issue that Kissinger threatened to resign over recently here, and that is the wiretaps on his own aides. And we had obtained information from 2 FBI sources that, in fact, Kissinger was the initiator of this. It seemed like a relevant story because the wiretaps had the existence of them had just been recently disclosed and confirmed by the FBI officially, and so I called him up to ask him about his role.
And it should be noted, I guess, this was in May of '73, and it's almost very, very similar to what's happened in the last 10 days with Dr. Kissinger in the same subject. He called Kissinger, and he was rather incredulous, Bob was, at what he had learned from these 2 FBI sources. And he said that he reached Dr. Kissinger on the phone, and Kissinger said hello, and Woodward explained that the reporters had information from 2 FBI sources that Kissinger had authorized taps on his own aides. Kissinger paused. It could be Mr. Haldeman who authorized the taps, he said. How about Kissinger, Woodward asked. I don't believe it was true, he stated. Is that a denial? A pause. I frankly don't remember. He might have provided the FBI with the names of individuals who had seen or handled various documents which had been leaked, Kissinger said. It is quite possible that the FBI construed this as an authorization. In possible individual cases, it is possible that I pointed out who handled what document to my deputy, who in turn would have passed on the information to the FBI. Woodward said that 2 sources had specified that Kissinger had personally authorized the taps. A brief pause. Almost never, Kissinger said. Woodward suggested that almost never meant sometimes. Was Kissinger then confirming the story? Kissinger raised his voice angrily. I don't have to submit to police interrogation about this, he said. Calming down, he went on, if it is possible, and if it happened, then I have to take responsibility for it. I'm responsible for this office. Did you do it? Woodward asked. You aren't quoting me, Kissinger asked. Sure he was, Woodward said. What? Kissinger shouted. I'm telling you what I said was for background. And here we should interject, I guess, that background means that the official, in this case Kissinger, is not to be quoted by name, and it's to appear as if it sort of came out of thin air. Woodward said that they had made no such agreement about background. Quote, "I've tried to be honest, now you're going to penalize me," Kissinger said. "No penalty intended," Woodward said, but he could not accept retroactive background. "In 5 years in Washington," Kissinger said sharply, "I've never been trapped into talking like this." Woodward wondered what kind of treatment Kissinger was accustomed to getting from reporters. And I think that, in a way, is really what this story is all about, the kind of treatment that the administration was accustomed to getting from reporters.
This is what the book's about, too. And, you know, I know that there's so much we can talk about. It's just touched upon this, really. Just the book, All the President's Men, dealing with an open society. How long will it be open? And it's open now, thanks in no small degree to the work of investigative journalism, Carl Bernstein and Bob Woodward. All the President's Men. Thank you very much.
Thank you.